the beginning of the 8th chapter of Bava Kama. Okay, the beginning of 8th chapter of Bava Kama. If this is a review, I just want to give a basic review, go over some difficult concepts, but they're all very practical. Chavala, personal injury, a very important topic. And we're going to start with the 8th chapter in Bava Kama, Hachova b'Chavero. So if you're in the Gemara, you just open it up. It is Daf Pei Gimel 83b. Okay, going to read from 83b in Bava Kama. Hachova b'Chavero. Okay, Bava Kama now takes a turn from your property doing damage to a person doing damage. Okay, so the Mishnah says that if you damage Hachova b'Chavero, chayev alav mishum chamisha dvar nezek tsar ripui sheves and boshes. As we know by now, compensation in personal injury is divided into 5 categories. Okay, we're going to talk about each one very briefly for those who didn't see the daf this week.
Bezalel, your Wi-Fi is working? It's really bad.
It's bad?
I don't know. You were cutting out. Maybe somebody else could hear you. I'm just saying, can you check that?
I can.
I don't have a problem at all.
Oh, so maybe it's just me. Okay, I'll move
Okay,
to
good.
different.
It's you.
It's Sally. I'm okay as
no
well.
problem.
If it's okay with my father, then Kal V'chomer, everyone should have a problem. That's an easy Kal V'chomer. That's a layup.
I was actually fine with it. I was just trying to get everybody involved. Participation.
Okay, good.
One could take that 2 ways, but I'm sure you only meant it one.
Right. So let's talk about nezek. Nezek is basically you damage someone, and now he's worth a little bit less on the open market. Now, today, we don't like to use the word market to offend some people, but basically, the way the Mishnah says is simas eno kates yado. I'm doing a little fast because we did this a few times already. Shiberes raglo rono sokilu eved nimkar b'shuk. We take your value, right? Everyone, if they were to be sold based on what an actuary would believe that your potential earnings are, because after all, we are what we earn in the eyes of the court. And if they were to take you at your present value after the injury, and if it's less than before the injury, then you would pay that difference. Okay, that's called nezek. Shaman kama hayafa v'kama hu yafa. Right, the difference between before injury and after injury. So tsar, okay, pain. The Mishnah says kabo b'shapur b'masmar. Right, if you poke someone with a hot nail, even on your fingernail, makom she'eno so chabur, a place that is not necessarily a place that you could get a wound. This is the old, well, how much would I have to pay you? And the Gemara develops a little bit more, but basically, how much do I have to pay you, like a bet? Okay, if I take your fingernail off, would you be okay with getting $1,000? So some people would jump at that opportunity. Some people would say, what are you, nuts? So it all depends on what kind of person and what kind of injury we're talking about. Ripoi, medical bills, hikahu chayav l'reposo. Basically, this is before insurance, right? You have to pay their medical bills. Alu bot smachim. If something grew, if growths grew because of the injury, right? A scab, it turned into something worse. Okay, if you could pin that growth because of the injury, then you are liable. Chayta v'nistra, what if it healed and then it was bad again and reopened and healed several times? This is a sign that it's not yet healed. So therefore, therefore chayav l'reposo, you are still obligated to pay, even if it's a long process. Chayta kol tzorcha in chayav l'reposo. Once it is healed and you were given, right, a new, right, it's healed, and the doctor said that you are good to go, then that's when the medical bills end. All right, there's no discussion about therapy. It didn't exist. So sheves. How about unemployment? We view this person in the lowest form of a job, which is what the Mishnah and the Gemara talks about. Like the lowest paying job is not a janitor, or is not something that we would say today. It's someone who watches cucumbers. Okay, someone that you don't have to be too high up on the IQ scale. Okay, and someone who doesn't really, walk very well, or someone who's not with his full faculties, a very, very basic job that someone could take. Okay, because we already gave him compensation for his hand and for his leg. So now we have to take into account what his value is at work. Okay, and obviously the Gemara goes through it, and we're going to see a little bit about how we view unemployment. Boshes, humiliation, when you defame someone, okay, it all depends on the stature of the one who is doing the embarrassing and the embarrassee. Okay, Rashi is a very, very difficult Rashi that discusses, depending on where you are in the socioeconomic scale, is commensurate to how much value there is in your defamement, when you defame somebody, or when you humiliate someone, right? Okay, so that's basically the Mishnah. So we're talking about Havala. Okay, now what's interesting is, we like to get to the roots of all these various isurim, right? We always look at the chinuch, we look at sources from the Torah. And Bava Kama basically deals with two kinds of damages, right? For the first, 2 months, we've dealt with my animal doing damage. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to, but a very basic beginner's course in Bava Kama is, well, where does the Torah actually discuss the prohibition about doing damage? And if you really look, it talks about how to assess damage, about Shane and Regel and Keren, and we spent weeks and weeks dissecting and bisecting the various ramifications of what happens when my property does damage if I set a fire. But there really is not a clear source in the Torah. One of the several opinions is V'ahavta l'orecha kamocha, meaning, right, you wouldn't want it done to you, so therefore watch your animal. But aside from that, some Rishonim talk about lo signov. There's a certain element of theft when you're not watching your animal and they do damage. But there's no really clear-cut lav in the Torah per se.
Rashi
Yeah.
2 days ago, and I'm a Beis tells us a different source
For doing damage or for doing chavala?
for doing a chavala. He says,
Right.
Pen Yosif.
Well, hold on, relax. So this was all.
I'm relaxed.
So you ruined my whole setup. So pretend no one heard that. So basically, when it comes to, it's called mamon hamazik versus adam hamazik. So when your possessions, there's really no source. When it comes to people damaging other people, right? Fist fights, that actually makes the 613. And we're going to see the chinuch right now. When you go all the way to number 595, a very unlikely discussion of where this is in the Minyan HaMitzvos is number 595 that talks about a very obscure prohibition on Bezdin not to give someone an extra lash. We know that there are 39 malchus that we give. The Torah says 40, we give 39. Maybe when we get to malchus, we'll have a shear why we give one less. But the way it worked is the doctor would do a estimate, and they would say, well, what kind of person is this that we're about to hit? And if they, for whatever reason, either by accident or on purpose, the shliach bezdin, the one whose job it is to actually do the whipping, if he gives one extra lash, that is one of the 613. That's one of the negative prohibitions. It's called pen yosef. Okay, you're not allowed to give one extra lash. And the Chachamim learn that this doesn't only apply to a shliach bezdin. It applies to every Jewish soul. I'm reading here from the Sefer Chinuch in 595. V'noheg Isser zel le'inyan shelo lahakos echas miYisrael. So in the beginning of 595, the Chinuch talks about what I just said about the setting being in a court setting, and someone who's chayav malchus, we try not to overhit. But when it comes to a regular person, believe it or not, we have the same prohibition. It says, "B'schar b'benekevos avle inyan iser hamosif malchus enonog ela enonoeg oso ha'inyan ela bizman yishuv haaretz shehaya lanu bezdin haru'oyin lahalkos." Right? That's when we had a bezdin, and there was a concept called malchus. Today, we don't have a concept of malchus anymore. But what we do have is al zevehika Yisrael hakad gedola sheis chayiv lo'oleh tashlumin shel pruta o yoser eno mischayiv malchus. Today, the prohibition is hitting your fellow Jew. You actually commit the lav of Pen Yosef, okay? But there's one problem. The problem is that we just read in the Mishnah that you have to pay compensation. And the Torah says that there's a chiyuv of malchus. And we already learned twice in this Masechta, we learned it in Ksuvas, we learned it several times, that when there's a conflict and a person is liable for malchus and they're liable to pay a money payment, you can't do both. Okay? It's called Einu Loka U'Mishalem. We don't give someone two penalties. So therefore, if you hit somebody and you cause damage, a significant damage, that's a pruta or more, so he pays and he doesn't get malchus. Right? The Chinuch says, Lefi shehu lav shenitan l'tashlumin, because it's a lav that you have to pay nezek and tsar and ripui, etc., as the Mishnah just enumerated. So here's an interesting fact. The Chinuch ends off by saying, what if I go over to someone and I take a toothpick and I push it into their finger and they don't assess a very large sum? In fact, it's such a minor right? It's such a minor infraction that you cause that it's not even worth a pruta. So believe it or not, chayiv aleha malchus. So on the one hand, you injured someone, so you're chayiv malchus. But on the other hand, right, there's no money payment. So you can't say, oh, I don't get malchus because there's a money payment. Here, there's no money payment. So if the money payment drops out, then you're left with malchus. And the Gemara, if you remember, in the third chapter in Ksuvas called Elunaris on Daf Lamed Beis and Lamed Gimel, the Gemara has a whole lengthy discussion. If you want to look over there, that's the source. Ula on Daf Lamed Beis in Ksuvas discusses this concept. So now we at least understand the 5 things you have to pay. And we see that this is actually a lav in the Torah. Okay? And the Shulchan Aruch brings this down as halacha. I'm reading from the Choshen Mishpat 420. Tough. Hachol b'chaver, aser la'adam lahakos chaver v'mikahu over belav shenemar pen Yosef. Now you're going to say, hold on a second. What is the context? And the Chinuch didn't say this, but the Shulchan Aruch is saying this flat out. The context is giving malchus to someone. Now, why is this person getting malchus? Presumably because he's an evil person. He committed a infraction and he is liable for malchus. So he's what we call a rasha. So we're going to say a kal v'chomer v'im hikpida Torah b'hakas rasha shelo lahakoso yoser al risho. So could you imagine the Torah is saying this person is chayiv malchus? He's no good. But yet, we are very lenient and say, do not give him one extra lash. So that's to a rasha. Kal v'chomer b'hakos tzaddik, certainly if we're dealing with not even a tzaddik, a non-Rasha, not in a context of Bezdin where the person is Chayav Malkus because he committed a sin. He's a regular, ordinary guy. He didn't sin. Certainly. Now, one side question we're not going to deal with is the question of Ein Onshin Min Hadin. How does that play into this, if at all? But put that on the side. For those who understand the Hamevin Yavin. But anyways, so getting back to the Shulchan Aruch, not only if you hit someone, okay, even though you just lift your hand, right? Everybody remembers Parsha Shmos when Moshe said Lama Takereyecha, right? Everybody remembers from Cheder that even though you didn't exactly hit someone yet, but as soon as you lift up your arm, you're already in that category. By the way, for those of you interested, the Ramah talks about B'din HaKos Ish L'Ishto. We're not going to get into this. I'm not going to touch this topic with a 10-foot pole, but there is a discussion about hitting your wife, where that fits into this. We're not going to talk about that now, but if you want to look, it is in the Ramah in 420 in Choshen Mishpat. The Gemara itself, where does the Shulchan Aruch get this from? I'm just going to read just a little bit of the Gemara in Sanhedrin. Gemara says, we're on Sanhedrin, Daf Nun Ches Amud Beis. Amar Reish Lakish, Hamagbia Yado Al Chaver, Afal Pi Shelo Hikau Nika Rasha Shenema Vayomer LaRasha Lama Takere Echa. Right? Again, what does Moshe say? Lama Takere Echa. What does Takeh mean? Why should you hit in the future? He didn't say Lama Hikita Lo Nemar. If Moshe was giving Musar to the person for hitting, he should have said Lama Hikita. If in fact it happened already, right? Why did you hit in the past tense? But it's Lama Take, why are you going to strike? Indicating that he didn't strike him yet, he just raised up his arm. Even if he ultimately doesn't hit him, he's still called a Rasha. Okay, that's what Afal Pi Shelo Hikau Nikra Rasha. Okay, and the Gemara goes on to say that it's a very bad thing. Brings a couple of other Agadic sources, one from Shmuel, that he's considered a chote. Okay. Anyway, so we see the Shulchan Aruch, we see the source in Masechah Sanhedrin. So I want to look now, because there is we're going to do a little bit lumdus now. We don't often do this, but I just thought that we look at a Rambam, and after 2.5 months of Bava Kama, by now we should be familiar with this concept of Mammon versus Kanas. We had it a lot in the first parak, and in Maruba we spent 2 weeks, right, aching over very, very difficult Gemaras, and we know, for example, stealing and paying back. Okay, you pay back the principal, that's called mammon. If you pay back more than the principal, that's called a kanas. For example, kefel, dald vehe, right? Sometimes the Torah proscribes a penalty to pay, like motzi shemra, you pay 100, you kill an eved, you pay 30, right? Sometimes we do something, and the penalty is what we called a kanas, right? Today's day and age, you double park, you go speeding, right? You have to pay $140. You didn't really do anything so terrible, but there's an element of penalty. So that's what we call a kanas. So there's a very, very interesting Rambam. Okay, the Rambam is in the 5th parak of Hachov Elumazik, Hilchas Hachov Elumazik. The Rambam says he actually looks at the nature of these 5 payments. And he says, some are considered mammon, meaning I'm paying you money because you actually lost money, right? Just like I steal from you. So, I mean, think about it this way. I stole from you $100. So the first thing I have to do is give you back your $100 back. Now we're even. Okay, that's called mammon. I have to pay you for what you lost. Now the Torah says, well, if you are a ganav, meaning if you did it in a way where is the middle of the night, and you were hiding from it, and you wore a ski mask, and you didn't want to be found, so then, as we discussed last week, we're going to charge you kefil. Why? Because you have extra chutzpah, right? You're afraid of, right? You're afraid of people. Remember, we spoke about this in last week's class, but you're not afraid of God. So we're going to tack on like a surcharge, right? When you get a ticket, you have to pay a surcharge. We're going to tack on another $100. Okay, so you're out another 100%. So the Rambam does a similar thing in some of the payments that you have to pay back when you pay back these 5 payments. Okay, so I'm reading the Rambam in the 5th chapter of Hilchas HaChovel U'Mazik. Hodeh HaChovel Shehu Chavel. So here's an interesting case. Getting back to Meruba, this concept of Moda B'Kanas, right? We know that if you're Moda B'Kanas, you're Pater. A person is a Ganaf. He wants to do tshuva. So, okay, he pays back the principal, but he fails terrible. He goes to Bezdin, right? Whether Adam come, forget about Adam come or later. Okay, he wants to pay back and he admits to court, we say Moda B'Kanas Pater. How about this case, the Rambam says, you go to Bezdin and say, you know what, I got angry yesterday, my team lost, I got into a bar fight, right? The guy missed the field goal at the end, and I punched the guy next to me. And he feels so bad, he goes to Bezdin and he says, I caused so much damage, the guy's in the hospital now, I don't know what to do. I am moda to the court that I punched someone's lights out. So says the Rambam, okay, he pays these 5 things. Shaharei ha'edim hayusham shenichnas latoch yado shalem b'shasa meriva v'yatza chavul. You know why he has to pay? Because the bar was full of people. There were 25 witnesses who saw what happened. So therefore, him coming to Bezdin is not going to get him off the hook. Okay? Avalim lo hayusham edim klal. What if there was no one there to witness? And he says, you know what? I'm going to be a tzaddik. I could deny everything, but I'm a good guy. I'm going to go to Bezdin, and I'm going to spill my guts and say what I did, but there were no Adim who could testify that he actually committed, right, this act of violence. So the Rambam says if no Adim were there, and he says, Hu amar chavalta bi, right, and he says, I committed this, v'hoda ma'atzmo, right? He's Moda. Remember Moda B'Kanas? So here's what the Rambam says. Pater min ha-nezek umin ha-tsar. We're going to take these 5 and we're going to differentiate. Number 1 and number 2, nezek and tsar, he's off the hook. Wow, that's a chiddush. V'chayiv b'sheves u'beboshes, and he's chayiv in sheves, unemployment, and boshes. Okay, he still has to pay. Uberipui al piatzmo. Okay, and he's also chayiv in ripui because of his own admission. He admits to it. So he admits to it. So let's think about this for a second. He's chayiv on 3, 4, and 5, but he's putter from 1 and 2. So this is, now the Gemara doesn't talk about this. The Rambam brings this up. So the question is, why does the Rambam view the first 2 elements, nezek and sar, as a kanas, as a penalty, right? So the Raavad, who is very famous for jumping on the Rambam when he disagrees, says the following: Omer Avram lo yadati lama pater me'ele. I have no idea why the Rambam says what he does when it comes to being pater from the first 2 payments of nezek and sar. I got no idea. V'ulai yomar, and maybe you shall say, mipnei shetzarich umdana. So let's put on our thinking caps for a second. What is 1 and 2 all about? 1 and 2, if you remember, the way the Mishnah described it is nezek. Remember what we said? The actuary has to figure out, okay, how much is this guy worth now that he got his fingers cut off by this person, right? A person is worth $2 million. Now he's worth about $1.5 million because he's lost the potential of $500,000 because he had two fingers cut off by this person. So that's what we call a umdana, an actuarial, right, formula where everything is taken into account. How about tsar? Remember tsar? Tsar is, well, we're going to figure out how much a person is willing to give up two fingers and take a payment for. That also is an actuarial number. When it comes to 3, 4, and 5, that's not an umdana. That's okay, well, these are real numbers. So therefore, because they're real numbers, maybe the Ravid said that's the reason why it's in a different category. So what does the Ravid say? Even though this person admits to injuring him, he doesn't know what kind of injury he caused this person. Therefore, he's pater. Aval sheves the haripui. Let's leave Boshes aside for a second because that's a very big debate. Okay? When it comes to sheves and ripui, shehem nirin la'ayin, right? Chayav. Meaning, I could go to a doctor and he could say, you know what, the medicine's going to cost X, the rehab's going to cost Y, you're going to be this, you're going to be that. And at the end of the day, he fills up a whole paper and he comes to a bottom line of medical cost. This is not a umdana. This is not a classic, well, let's ask a person what his value is. These are real-time payments. So maybe that's why the Rambam differentiates between these two categories. The Ravid says, no good. Why? Because the Ravid says they all need an estimate. Meaning, even when you go for Ripui and Sheves and Boshes, they also need to be estimated. Hilkach, Chayav B'kol, or Patur Min HaKol. So it's either or, he says, Rambam. You can't differentiate. They either all or none. So the Ravid basically has no idea why the Rambam differentiates. So there happens to be a far off Mesha Chachma that I found at the end of Parshas Emor. Okay, now Parshas Emor, the end of Parshas Emor discusses a little bit of what Mishpatim discussed. Right, when you talk about places in the Torah that discuss damages, so there's really three places. Okay, there is Kitetse, there is Mishpatim, okay, which most of Bava Kama comes from, and then the end of Emor, if you remember, all the way at the end, there's the story of the person who curses, right? And Moshe says he had to ask what the rule is, and they put the person in Mishmar, they weren't sure. And then it says, well, you have to stone him. Oh, and by the way, now that we're talking about damages and stoning, so it talks about restitution. And the pasuk says, "V'ish ki yiten mum ba'amito, kasher asa ken ye'asalo." Okay? I.e., ayin tachas ayin, right? A few days ago, we spent 2 blot discussing ayin tachas ayin, right? The concept, is it literal? Obviously, it's not literal. But it's basically this for that. All right, what we call quid pro quo. If you cause damage to someone, you took out his eye, we are going to, not like Hammurabi, take out your eye, we're going to cause you the value of what this eye cost, and we're going to make you pay for it. That the Torah says is kasher asa ken ya'aselo, tit for tat. Says the Meshech Chachma. Okay? Ready for this? Lefi HaKabbalah, says the Meshech Chachma, shehu tashlume mamon, tzarech lahavin madua lo kasav achiyuv al ha'adam atzmo, k'mo shekasav etzel behema yishamena. When it comes to an animal damaging, it says umaka nefesh, right? And then it says umaka behema yishalmena. You pay. So shehu chiyuv al guf ha'adam l'shalom mimashi yeshlo. You damage an animal, then you have to, what the word is mishalem, which literally in Hebrew means to make whole, right? To compensate. That's why the right? In Lashon HaKodesh, the word to pay for is l'shalem. It also means to make whole, because the two are, I don't know if anybody ever picked up on that, but the two are obviously related, right? You make someone whole by paying them what you owe them, right? So sheken chiyav ala guf adam l'shalom mima sheyesh lo, ken chayav l'shalom hachavala shechava b'chaveru. So too, I have to pay someone back. But the Meshech Chachma asks, this is a funny way of telling a person that he's got to pay for damage. Let the Torah say, if you damage someone, you shall mena. What does it mean? Like I did to him, it gets done to me in return. That's a very funny expression, says the Meshech Chachma. Umikan eid mochiach kashitas Rabbeinu Moshe. So, believe it or not, the Meshech Chachma brings down the Rambam. Now, the Meshech Chachma in the Torah is usually known for his Agadic interpretation and beautiful Dvar Torahs. He doesn't really often get into Shitas HaRambam in Halachos. But here is an exception where he brings down the Rambam, V'hi Shitas Rabo Harim bin Migash, the Pegam Hu Nezek, Ein Mishalem Im Hoda B'lo Eidim. He says, now I know the source where the Rambam that we read inside gets his rule that if he decides, if the mazik decides to admit in court where there's no Eidim, we say Moda b'kanas is pater. Rakim yesh Eidim sheyatza chavo mibeso, as opposed to if there actually are witnesses. Yin Perakei Mehilchas Chovel Mazik, he brings down our Rambam that we read already. The Kivan Dolo Rami Aleha Tashlumin Al Yidei Hadaso Bifnei Bezdin below Eidim Lo Rami Aleha Tashlumin. So the Meshech Chachma says, because the obligation of payment through his own admission, assuming there are no witnesses, therefore you don't have to pay anything. Rak al Bezdin Mutoligvos Hemenu Al Yidei Eidim. This payment is tied to Bezdin. It's not tied to the person. Bezdin has to go, if they really want this payment to be made, they have to come up with witnesses. But if there's no witnesses, then the person doesn't have to pay because he admitted, and we apply the concept of Moda b'kanas pater, right? Rak al Bezdin mutar ligvos himenu aydei edim. Levad sheves v'ripui, except for sheves and ripui, shehu mamon u'mishalem b'hodas. Then that becomes mamon payment, and he pays it when he admits it. Therefore, ken yinasen. Therefore, it's tit for tat. I caused someone an injury. I did something to someone. So therefore, I caused him to be unemployed for 2 weeks. So I have to pay his salary. I caused him $2,000 in medical bills. So I have to pay him back. Dirak lebezdin asa rachmana. This whole kasher asa kenya solo is directed to Bezdin. It says rak shifto yiten v'rapo yirapa chiyuv al gufa adam batzmo. That I have to pay the person. V'zet diuk nifla mora al amitas shitas rabbeinu. He says this is exactly what the Rambam is referring to, where he gets his rule about if I admit I am pater from nezek, because why? Because it's only on kasher. It's only on kasher asa kenya asalo. It's only tit for tat when what? When there's proof. But if there's no proof, then it's up to Bezdin to find the Eidim. So the Meshech Chachma says this funny way the Torah describes retribution is exactly the proof of how the Rambam differentiates between Nezek and Sar and between the other three payments of Sheves, Ripui, and Boshes. I thought that was a beautiful diuk that the Meshech Chachma made. There's another source from one of the Achronim, the Rav Elchanan in the Rishima Shiurim. His proof where he thinks the Rambam gets his gets his opinion to differentiate. He says, "V'hinei pasuk." I'm reading from the Rishima Shiurim, which is Rav Elchanan. V'hinei pasuk haRambam shesheves v'ripui hem chiyiv mamon v'lo chiyiv v'knas. Right? Sheves and ripui are mamon and not knas. V'nir שהטעם הוא משום שנלמד מפסוק מיוחד. He says, you don't have to use svara. Sometimes the answer is flat out in the Torah. It says, Rak shifto yitain, v'rapo yirapeh. The key word is yitain. V'lo mahapsukim ha'cher b'chavala shal nezek tzar boshes. When it comes to nezek, tsar, and boshes, the Torah doesn't use the word yitain. Ubebir ha'hevdel b'psukim nir dehecha she'atorah kasva es haloshon shel tachas, go on ayin tachas ayin, right? We learn damages from ayin tachas ayin, o petza tachas patza, ratzalomer shebe'etzem roy lihanish et hachovel lachasru aver o litza'aro. We want to punish the aggressor by taking away his hand, o litza'aro o l'baisho tachas ma she'asa l'nechbal. We want to get revenge. And what he tried to do, we do to him, but, what's the big but? The Torah has rachmanas on him. Umishalem mamon ki inyan kofer. He pays like ransom money. When it comes to these very stringent punishments, right? So that's the penalty. When it comes to the payment of sheves and ripoy, lo nakta haTorah milas tachas, ela milas yitain. What does yitain mean? Give. I caused you an injury, I will pay you. Tachas is in substitute for. In substitute for, I should do, right, what happened, what should be done to me is what I tried to do for you. That's what the word substitute or tachat. That we say, well, we're not going to do literally, right? We're just going to not take your eye out. We're going to cause you, right, to pay for it. But yitain is a direct payment. He says it's very simple. That's exactly why those payments of ripoy and sheves are direct payments that are considered mamon as opposed to kanas. So therefore, the Rambam says you can't get out of making a payment of ripoy and bosha and sheves just because you went over to court and said, oh, I want to do tshuva, I admit I hurt someone. That's too late already because the Torah says yitain, you have to give it. You do have an opportunity when it's a kanas, because a kanas signifies something that's not exactly owed, such as, here, you take out someone's eye, so we should really take out your eye, but we're going to figure out a payment, but that payment is never exact, so therefore, that falls into the kanas category. So that's the way the Rav Elchanan explains the Rambam over here. All right, so I thought those were some nice interpretations of where the Rambam gets this, controversial opinion of separating nezek and tsar from ripoy, sheves, and boshes. Now, the Rambam, we're always lumping the concept of boshes, but together with ripoy and sheves in the view of the Rambam. But the truth is that it's not so simple. Meaning, there is actually a debate whether boshes is mamon or, in fact, it's a kanas. So the Rambam, the Maggid Mishnah brings down the Rimigash, who actually disagrees, and he disagrees with the Rambam. He says the Rambam says that boshes is a kanas, right? Even though it's a kanas, but what's the exception? It's a kanas, but the Rambam says that the payment, I'm reading the words. Afal pikan kasav Rambam shenitan l'chayav tashlume boshes al pi hodaso machmas tam zesh aboshes lo higialo ela b'shah shahoda. So this is a funny category because when does the obligation of boshes come in? The reason why the Rambam says that it's considered a knas is because even though it's a knas, you still have to pay it. Meaning, if I admit to the court that I did this damage, even though it's a knas, you still have to pay it, because then as soon as you admit it, that's when the obligation kicks in. When you injure someone on Monday, right, that person feels the pain on Monday. He's got to go to the emergency room on Monday. But if this person who did the injury comes in on Tuesday to court and says, I did the boshes, then the person who got the damage done to him doesn't feel the boshes until the person actually went to court on Tuesday. So that's why the Achronim explain that the chiyuv only kicks in as soon as the chovel goes to Bezin and admits it. So even though he admits it, he still has to pay for the punishment of boshes. So I thought that was interesting, little tidbit. Now, we learned on Shabbos's daf, I believe, daf Pei Vav, we had a discussion about kavanah, about intent, right? The Mishnah on Pei Vav Amud Beis, if you remember, said that if a person embarrasses someone by accident, okay, then he's not liable. The Gemara has a pasuk that they learn it from that we're going to discuss in a second, but that's also a big discussion in the Achronim, meaning what is the reason why you're off the hook if you embarrass someone by accident or without intent? Does it have to do with when I did it? Meaning, if I damage someone by accident, we have a concept, if you remember from the end of the first perek, called Adam Muad La'olam. It doesn't matter whether you did it on purpose or not. You are chayiv. You are responsible for your actions, whether or not you did it on purpose. The one exception is by boshes. So there happens to be, we're not going to get into it, there happens to be a hakira as to this concept of boshes. Did you actually, meaning is it viewed that you actually didn't do it and that mice didn't occur, or is it, no, you did it, but there's a special patur? So we're not going to get into it, but what I would like to get into is, and we discussed this, I think, in Ksubis about a year and a half ago, when we're talking about Boshes Upagam, where this concept of Boshes is mentioned in the Torah, right? We mentioned that most everything is from Mishpatim and Parshas Emor, but the Parsha of Boshes is tucked all the way at the end of Kitetse. At the end of Kitetse, the Torah gives the following scenario. Ki yenatzu anashim yachtav, ish ve'achiv. Okay, there are two people who are, right, fighting. The karva eshes ha'echad, and the wife of one of the two people fighting wants to save her husband, like any good wife, right, out there wants to do. She wants to rescue her husband. Lahatzilas isha miyad mekehu, right? So how does she, in the act of rescuing her husband, the shalcha yada v'hichzika b'mavusha, she takes out her hand and seizes the private parts of this aggressor who's fighting her husband. Okay, so that is the setting of the parsha of Boshes. So the Torah says says kappa, right? Dvarim chapter 25 verse 12 says the verdict is you have to cut her arm off. Lo tachos einecha, don't show any pity. So this is, we mentioned it, like I said back in Ksubis, this is a obviously very, very difficult, like you would never believe that this is where we learn the concept of defamation and humiliation, but nevertheless, this is exactly the predicament that the Torah discusses the parsha of Boshes. There's not enough time to discuss why we have this, far out example. I wanted to just focus in on one sforno that is out of this world that I happen to see. Now, I mentioned that this is in an obscure, is filled with, I believe it's 74 mitzvos, the most in any parsha. And when you read Parshas Ki Teitzei, it is mitzvah after mitzvah, and there is seemingly no order. But if you go to the end of Ki Teitzei, right, we have the parsha of Gittin, of divorces. We have the parsha of Yibum, right? Now, how does Parshas Yibum start off? If you remember, it says Ki yeshvu achim yachtav. Brothers are sitting together. One of them dies, and the Torah goes into the rule of Yibum. Immediately after it discusses Yibum and then Chalitza, the very next pasuk, pasuk 11 of chapter 25, starts off by saying Ki yanatzu anashim yachtav ish v'achiv. So sometimes the commentators like to find a common thread between two seemingly, right, distant episodes. You're going to say, what does this have to do with anything? So the Sforno says as following. This is unbelievable. Afal pisha hayavama mitzav levazos es achei baila. We just finished learning, remember, what was pasuk 10? The rule of chalitza, right? You all remember chalitza? What happens, right? Chalitza, the woman takes off the boot, spits. What is spitting? Spitting is actually, right? We had that in today's daf or tomorrow's daf. Spitting, rakika, is a form of embarrassment. So the whole process of chalitza, the woman is embarrassing her brother-in-law. She's publicly shaming him. Why? Says the Sforno al shalochas al baila, because this Yavama, right? This Yavam failed to do his duty by marrying her. He has a Torah obligation to marry his dead brother's wife, and he didn't do it. As a punishment, so to speak, he has to get embarrassed in front of everyone in court by having this sister-in-law spit at him. Isn't that embarrassing? Right? We learned, or we're about to learn in Pasuk 11, that you can't embarrass. So that's the connection the Sforno draws between these two episodes. What's the Chiddush? Says the Sforno at the end, nevertheless, lo hutur leish levayishas hanilcham im baila. So I thought about this for a very, very long time, and I didn't come up with a connection of why you're allowed to, but the Sforno says, even though you're allowed to embarrass your brother-in-law in one situation, could you imagine a situation where you're trying to save your husband in a fight and you don't know what's going to end up in that fight? He could be stabbed to death. You have no idea. So she is resorting to trying to save him, and she accidentally, right? Accidentally. That's the point over here, the Sforno says. You accidentally embarrass someone else, but that you're liable for. You're not liable for spitting at your brother-in-law in front of 100 people in court. But you are liable, nevertheless, to, right, when you embarrass someone who's trying to kill your husband by accident. That's what he says. So that is a humongous chiddush. I need to further think about that because there's a lot behind that, but I just saw that today. But that's definitely, serious food for thought. I wanted to, in the next minutes, discuss, we spoke about a little bit about, now there's a lot to talk about, Boshes, humiliation, that's a sheer within itself. We spoke a little bit about the Kanas aspect. I want to talk a little bit about Sheves. Okay, the Gemara doesn't go into that as much as others, but we saw, if you remember on Daf Pehei Amud Beis, the Gemara is discussing, well, true, all five are paid, but do you ever pay shalobim kom nezek? What if you injure someone and you don't cause any of the other four? Like, for example, how do you cause pain without nezek? If you poke someone. So you didn't really devalue him. He could still go to work, right? If he puts on a Band-Aid and no one sees it, there's no humiliation. So the Gemara goes through each of the 5 concepts and actually isolates that you could actually, be chayiv on one without the other. One of the interesting examples that the Gemara gave was, what about sheves? How am I liable to pay someone, okay, to compensate them for their lost salary without having to pay the other 4? Well, it's very simple. What if I lock him in a room for a month? I give him food, I give him ventilation, I give him everything. The problem is he has no Wi-Fi and he can't go to work, so he can't work at home. So he loses a month's salary, right? He's out $10,000. So because I locked him in the room, the only payment I have to make for him is this payment of $10,000 because he couldn't work for that month. So there's a very interesting question that the Ramban brings up. He says, so there's a concept we learned in the 6th perek, and before that, called grama, where grama ben Ezekiel is pater. If I indirectly damage someone, right, I'm pater. Then there's a category that's not 50%, it's closer to 75%. If I damage someone, even though it's indirectly, but it's such a obvious damage, right? The Gemara we're going to see in a couple of weeks brings the example of hasoref shtar. What if a person has a shtar? In today's day and age, a check. You have a check for $1 million, and I burn it up. Right? What did I do? I damaged the check that's worth about 2 cents, right? You have ink and you have paper. So if you technically look at it, all I did was cause you 2-cent damage. Now, what's behind this check is that you are the lucky bearer of $1 million US. That's what a check is. So assuming you can't get another check, and the one who wrote it died, let's say, you have no way of depositing or cashing this $1 million. So you sue him for $1 million, and he says, I'm going to pay you 2 cents because all I did was burn up a piece of paper. This is Webster's definition of garmi. It's not a grama, it's not a 50% damage, and it's not 100 because I didn't burn up $1 million of yours in cash. I burnt up a check. So a check is another way of a form of payment. So that's what we call a garmi. So the Ramban asks, what did I do over here? Right? I locked you in a room. Did I prevent you actively from not going to work? All I did was close the door, so now you can't go to work. I didn't take away your job. I didn't injure you. And therefore, because of the injury, you couldn't perform your work. All I did was lock you in the room. So believe it or not, the Ramban asks, why is this not a case of garmi? And the Rabbanan, who do not believe, right, who do not hold someone liable when it comes to garmi, then why am I chayiv in the sheves payment? All I did was prevent you from making money. So the answer that they give is because I locked you in the house. As soon as I lock you in the house, that's when the actual money, that's when the actual financial hit takes place. Okay, he gets around it. It's not such a great answer. I think the question is better than the answer, but basically he's saying it's because you have no other way out. So as soon as that moment comes when I lock you in, we stop time and says there is no way for this person to do work now. So that's actually one discussion in Sheves. The other discussion is a discussion between the Rosh and Rabbeinu Shmuel. they actually have a discussion about whether I let him in the room. I mean, we're getting pretty technical over here. It's almost like the rule about Sad on Shabbos, right? If an animal comes into my house and I just close the door, right, is that considered hunting or not? I didn't lead him in the house. So I just thought we're not going to get into it, but there's a lot of dissection over here that one could do about this specific, money payment of Sheves. There's actually a Yam Shel Shlomo. Okay, we're going to end off by saying the Yam Shel Shlomo has a discussion about. I'm going to read it. Yesh lachkor be'inyan chiyuv shel sheves imu dafka bevitul malachto. So let's talk about it. You're a secretary. You make $20 an hour. You work 7 hours a day, so you make $140 a day. So each day that you can't work, I have to pay you $140. So is that what we're talking about over here? Or what I am liable is what we call in today's business world opportunity cost. Meaning you don't necessarily get paid by the hour, but you're a deal maker. And you could spend 3 months making no money, or you could spend 1 hour making one call and landing $1 million deal. So there's, believe it or not, I mean, this is when, we start thinking of how do we view this concept of sheves, of paying for someone's employment, right? Is it just per dollar per hour, or oshayach al kol miniyas reva? Ki b'gemar lo matzinu chiyav sheves al misha bitlo memlachto kagon shahaya nokev margolios. Someone who makes pearls. Aval yesh ladun ech yeh hadin bechen v'niyos hocha shem raviach b'chanutzu kol yom. A storekeeper doesn't necessarily get a straight salary. He could have a good day. It's like a stockbroker. You could have a good day. You could have a bad day. So why do you assume that each case you pay someone by the hour when most people, not most people, a certain segment of the population, their income fluctuates on the market on any given day? So you are causing someone the loss of an opportunity to make a lot of money, right? So are you chayiv in that kind of sheves? And if you are, how in the world do you evaluate that? So that, okay, we don't have enough time. We're going to end on that. But my point is that, that's a very hard thing. As he says over here, the Yam Shel Shlomo, I'll just read a couple of lines. Yesh lifshot suffix the Yam Shel Shlomo answers. Ki Yam Shel Shlomo kasuv she'ein shaman b'teshlomei sheves ma shehayachol istakol arviach. We do not take into consideration what we call opportunity cost. Mishum she'ein anu yodin b'vadaut shehaya matzliach b'schor. So we have no idea if he's going to be successful. So therefore, we can't force someone to pay that you cause someone a possible very big loss by not letting him do what he is able to do. Okay, he goes on and on, but 9 o'clock, I just thought I would shed some light on various, potpourri